Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. In the last episode, we watched Lie to Diep and James quietly share the rent, face a sudden payment notice, and start standing together as a real team. Today, we'll discover how one simple page of conditions gently leads them all the way to a tiny aisle, plain rings, and a quiet yes that finally makes them a family. If this warm, emotional story touches you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. By the time the clock on the wall slid toward mid-morning, Lee Tu Diep's yes was sitting on the kitchen table like a living thing, even though it was only a single page of handwritten terms. And in that narrow window before she walked out the door, the emotional risk of it felt as sharp and fragile as a leaf trembling on a branch before a storm. She had written that yes herself, with clear lines and simple words. Nye's well-being first, no control through money, simple shared finances, a small circle, a slow pace. And James had accepted each point without flinching. But today was the day it would move from the safety of paper into the real world of keys and doors and documents and other people's eyes. The appointment they had penciled at the small office, a plain aisle, 2 witnesses, brief vows, simple rings, was hours away. Yet the ticking in her chest made it feel as if the building itself was counting down. Yes, no, speak now or step back, stay, leave. Trust this new shape or keep everything as it is. For James, the risk was different, but no less real. Ever since Not My Son had cut through his old life, every yes he spoke felt like a chance to rebuild or to repeat patterns he never wanted to see again. And while he had walked through the kitchen that morning with easy movements, taking bowls off the shelf, checking the folder with their papers, there was a carefulness under his calm, the kind a man carries when he knows another person's history with broken promises lies on the table next to his own. Nye, too, felt the charge in the air. She had already put on her best blue dress, then changed into her softer beige one, then back again, as if blue-beige could answer a question her mother had not yet voiced, bright joy or quiet steadiness, which did the day require. The first practical obstacle arrived in the most ordinary way. When James opened the room rent folder to tuck in a fresh copy of the one-page terms, the corner of an older document caught his eye, the identity paper the office had asked him to bring, and the ink at the bottom, where his signature sat, had blurred from a spill weeks ago, the letters slightly smudged. "I should reprint this," he said, half to himself, smoothing the page. "They might not care, but it looks like I don't know how to take care of my own name." It was a small thing, but in a story already built around papers and names, it carried weight. For a man once dismissed with "not my son," the idea of presenting anything that looked less than clear at an official desk gathered unease around it. The nearest copy shop was not far, but it meant leaving the apartment, leaving the table where her yes still lay without a final signature, and interrupting the fragile quiet they had fallen into. "Go," Lee Tu Diep said finally, adjusting the collar of his shirt with a brief, familiar touch. "If that paper will make you stand straighter, it's worth 10 minutes. Her words were practical, but the way she smoothed the fabric over his shoulder added warmth that ink could not. As he slipped on his shoes, Nye grabbed the light scarf she had been folding and unfolded it around his neck even though the air was only barely cool. "In case it rains on the way," she said, tying a knot that was more symbolic than functional. "And so you remember to come back fast. Tea, cookies if you come back fast." That little act, a child's scarf, a small bribe of imaginary cookies, took the edge off the first rise of tension, restoring breath to the room. When the door closed behind him, the key turning with the soft, familiar sound that had become their shared heartbeat. The apartment shrank back to its two remaining occupants. Diep wiped down the table in slow circles, cleaning crumbs that weren't really there, then picked up the one-page yes and read through it again. Each condition a reflection of battles she had already fought. No decisions about Nye without her voice. No using money as a leash. No big parties meant to impress. No rushing ahead of what their daily life could sustain. That page, more than any expensive contract, felt like a guardrail built from every lesson her single mom had taught her at worn kitchen tables years ago. As she laid it back down, folded once but not hidden, her phone buzzed with a message, and the second rise came sharp and quick. A note from the neighbor who was supposed to be their second witness. The kind woman who had once brought faded ornaments for their Noel string, saying her grandson had woken with a fever and she might be late or not make it at all. "I am so sorry," the message read. "If you need someone else, I understand." The words were kind, but they carried a familiar sting. Once again, something important in her life was at risk of being reduced to "we'll see," because of circumstances no one had planned for. A small question surfaced. Yes, no, proceed today with just one witness and whatever official the office provided, or postpone and risk letting fear slip in and turn a simple delay into a reason to never walk that aisle at all. For a moment, Diep felt old patterns tugging. Years of hearing "maybe tomorrow" from people who never showed, and the temptation to call it all off, to keep the safety of their current arrangement, pricked at her. The sky outside seemed to answer, a light rain beginning to tap against the window, soft but insistent, as if the world itself was reminding them that even gentle days carry small storms. Seeing her mother's face tighten, Nye moved closer without asking any questions, simply setting the little drawing she had made, a narrow aisle with 3 small figures and a 4th at the side, labeled "Neighbor Witness," in front of her. "If today is blue or beige," she whispered conspiratorially, "we still have us. If Ms. Hoa comes later, she can see the rings when we eat rice." That child's version of contingency planning, rooted not in logistics, but in relationship, made something in Diep's chest ease. James returned sooner than expected, hair damp at the edges, scarf slightly askew, a fresh copy of the document held carefully in his hand, like something fragile but won. "The man at the shop fixed the smudge," he reported, shaking the drops from his sleeves before stepping fully inside. "No questions, just a clean page. I think I needed that more than the office will." When he saw the look on Diep's face and the phone in her hand, he paused mid-step. What happened? She passed him the message about the witness, watching his features shift, not into frustration but into thought. "Witnesses come in many forms," he said after a beat. "If she can't stand with us at the desk, she has already stood with us at this table, with her ornaments and her tea. We can ask if the office will accept someone else if needed. If not, we breathe and choose again. The important part for me is that your yes doesn't depend on whether another grown-up can make it down the stairs on time." It was reassurance rooted not in optimism but in shared values, meaning over price, consent over spectacle, substance over schedule. He set the reprinted paper beside the one-page terms, aligning their corners with quiet care. "Do you still want this to be today?" he asked gently. "Yes, no, stay, leave. This is your home, your child, your life. My love is not going to expire at noon." The question opened space instead of pressing it closed. In answering it, her mind reached back to a detail she had never fully voiced to him, a truthful past that now reframed the present. Years ago, heavily pregnant and scared, she had once stood outside a dull office much like the one they were planning to walk into. A different man at her side. That man's hand resting on a list of conditions he had written without her input. Where they would live, who would handle the money, what she would be allowed to do once the baby came. The clerk at the window had called their number, and she had looked at that list and felt her throat close. Instead of stepping forward, she had whispered to the man that she was dizzy and needed water, then walked out into the air and never went back. There had been no aisle that day, only a long road of single motherhood and quiet resilience. Telling James this now, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, she let the words fall without drama. "That was my first almost ceremony," she said. "No rings, just rules I hadn't written. Today is the first time I see my own handwriting at the center of the page." He did not try to erase the old story with promises. He simply nodded, acknowledging the ghost in the room. "Then whatever we do next," he replied, "has to honor that. If we walk that little aisle, it's because your yes feels like yours, not like an escape from loneliness or a bargain with fear." The moment balanced there, the choice point waiting. Diep looked at the three most important objects on the table. The key resting in its small dish, the one-page conditional yes with her clear terms, and the freshly printed document with his name unsmudged. Nye, sensing the gravity of the pause, slid her small hand onto her mother's forearm, not pulling, just anchoring. "I don't want to wait for someone else's calendar anymore," Diep said at last, her voice steady. "People have been late or missing for most of my life. Today, we are here. We have the papers. We have a child who already thinks of us as a team. And we have a witness who may arrive late, but has already proven her heart many times." She looked at James and then at the clock. "So my answer is yes. Not a maybe, not a if everything is perfect. Yes, today, at the time we agreed. If the neighbor can stand with us, good. If not, she will eat with us tonight and bless the rings with rice and stories. We'll ask the office if Nye can stand as the second witness if needed. She has seen more of our real life than anyone else." It was a yes with conditions honored, a yes that did not ignore risk, but chose to move forward anyway. James exhaled, some taut line inside him relaxing, and reached into his pocket, touching the small box he had been carrying for days. 2 plain bands, nothing flashy, chosen because they could be worn while washing dishes or signing neighbor papers, symbols meant for everyday life rather than display. "Then I'll call and confirm our time," he said, picking up his phone, his thumb hovering just a second over the number before he pressed it. The brief conversation was practical, almost dull, confirming names, checking that documents were in order, asking about witnesses in a calm tone. But when he hung up and set the phone down, there was a new stillness in the room. "They'll see us at 3, he reported. "They said as long as one adult witness is there, they'll accept a responsible child as the other. The rain should be light by then." Nye, hearing that, immediately announced she would make a new drawing for 3 o'clock, with a clock in the corner and the word yes written in big letters over a small aisle. As Diep gathered the papers into the folder, slipped the one-page terms into the front, and placed the key on top for just a second, a quiet ritual that tied their living space to the step they were about to take. The quiet landing of the moment unfolded. Lunch to be cooked, clothes to be pressed, hair to be brushed, a neighbor to be sent a message that said, 3 o'clock, come if you can. And in James's pocket, the plain rings resting like 2 small promises waiting for the short walk down a narrow hallway and a simple aisle that would carry them from careful yes on paper to vows spoken out loud. The afternoon moved forward in small, practical steps, rather than grand gestures. After lunch, dishes were rinsed and stacked to dry. Diep took a moment in front of the mirror, not to transform herself, but to smooth her hair into a simple clip the way her single mom had taught her for serious days, and to check that the collar of her blouse lay flat. James changed his shirt for one that still held its color at the elbows, sliding the small ring box into his pocket and patting it once, more to steady his nerves than to check its presence. Nye, who had finally settled on the blue dress for courage and the beige sweater for calm, carefully folded her new drawing and tucked it into her little bag, declaring that witnesses needed papers too. When the neighbor's reply arrived, a brief message saying she would do her best to be there, but might be a few minutes late because of her grandson, the old knot of worry tugged again at Diep's stomach. But this time it did not tighten quite as hard. The decision had been made, the time set, and whether the neighbor stood beside them at the exact moment or joined them later at the table, the path they had chosen did not have to bend for every gust of circumstance. The light rain outside had settled into a fine mist by the time they locked the door, the click of the key turning as familiar as breath now. James watched as Diep paused to place her hand over the key for a heartbeat before slipping it into her bag, a tiny ritual, as if she were blessing the home to wait for them and remain theirs when they returned. The walk to the small office was not long, but each step felt layered. The three of them moving in a loose line, Nye hopping over shallow puddles, James matching his pace to Diep's stride, neither rushing nor lagging behind. They passed the little copy shop where he had reprinted his document that morning, and he squeezed her hand gently, a wordless reminder that even ink could be corrected when someone cared enough to fix it. The building that housed the office was plain. No arches, no flowers, just a glass door with a metal handle that had been polished by thousands of hands before theirs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution, familiar to anyone who has ever stood in line to sign something that mattered more than its plain surroundings suggested. A receptionist glanced up, took their names, and pointed them toward a row of simple chairs along the wall. There was no music, no aisle yet, just a scuffed path between desks and a clock ticking a polite beat overhead. Sitting there, with a folded folder in her lap and the one-page terms at the front, Diep could feel her heart beating louder in her ears than the footsteps in the hallway. But then Nye leaned against her side, swinging her feet slowly and laying the edge of her drawing on her mother's knee. "Look," she whispered, showing the little picture of the narrow aisle and three figures. "I made you taller than Uncle James here so they know you were strong first." The child's logic brought a small smile to Diep's face, easing some of the strain around her eyes, and when James caught the edge of that smile, it passed to him like a quiet blessing. A door opened across the room and an official appeared, calling their family name, mispronouncing it slightly but with no malice. As they stood, the second small jolt of the day came in the form of the empty doorway behind them. There was no neighbor yet, no second adult witness shuffling in apologetically with a bag of oranges to make up for lateness. For the briefest moment, Diep's old instinct to halt flared. Postpone, reschedule, wait until all the columns were neatly filled and every piece was in place. But then she felt Nay's hand slide more firmly into hers, that small palm warm and sure. "We can stand," the child said, more to herself than anyone else. "I am big enough today." James glanced toward the entrance once, then back at Diep, and in that look there was a wordless question and an answer both. They had agreed that witnesses came second to truth, that this step was about the three of them acknowledging what was already true at their table. "Let's go," she said softly. The words simple but carrying years of choosing to keep walking. They followed the official down a short hallway that might as well have been an aisle in that moment. The scuffed floor and muted walls turned into a kind of sacred passage by the weight of what they were bringing with them. Inside the small room, there was no arch, just a desk and 2 chairs on one side, and a narrow space in front where couples usually stood. The official gestured to that spot, and they arranged themselves without needing instruction. James on one side, Lee to Diep on the other. Nye just a step behind, clutching her folded drawing and looking up with wide, solemn eyes. The official ran through the basics with efficient kindness, checking names and documents, pausing briefly at the 1-page sheet Diep had added to the folder. "This is not standard," he remarked, raising an eyebrow at the list of conditions written in her neat hand. "No," James replied calmly, "but it is essential for us." The man considered for a moment, then nodded. "It's between you," he said, placing it back on top of the legal forms. "If you both sign it and you bring it home, that is also part of today." That small acknowledgement, that their personal terms mattered as much as the standard text, settled like a quiet affirmation in the room. As the official began the brief, formal wording, James's mind flashed once to his father, to that cold sentence, "Not my son," spoken in another office, and he felt for a heartbeat as if his knees might soften under him. To steady himself, he watched Lie to Diep instead, the way she held her shoulders, the way her breath moved the fabric of her blouse, the way her gaze did not flicker away from his even when the phrases about responsibility and support came into the formal script. When it was their turn to speak, there were no long speeches, just the short vows they had agreed on at the kitchen table. James went first, fingers shaking just enough to make the paper rustle as he unfolded it. "I promise," he said, voice low but clear, "to stand beside you at this table and in this life. To share the bills, the dishes, the decisions about Nye. To speak truth even when it is uncomfortable, and to never use money or silence to punish. I cannot promise that I will never fail, but I promise that if I do, I will face it with you, not behind your back." When he finished, he folded the note back along the crease and slipped it into the folder, as if to say these words belonged with the other papers that held their daily lives. Then it was Diep's turn. She had not written her vow down, but she had turned it over in her mind through many nights. "I promise," she said, "to let you stand with us, not just for us. To let this be partnership, not rescue. To protect Nye's heart as fiercely as always, and to open space for you in our small home. Not as a guest, but as family. I promise to remember that you are not the man who left me, and I am not the woman who walked away from that first office. We are new people with old scars, and I will not hold your hand today while holding his shadow over you." The room was very quiet when she finished, the kind of quiet that comes after something solid has been placed in the center. The official, who had heard countless variations of vows, seemed to nod in a small, private appreciation. "Rings?" he asked. James produced the simple bands from his pocket, palms a little damp. As they slid them onto each other's fingers, the symbolism felt less like ornament and more like an everyday tool, something meant to live with soap, rice, and paper, not just flowers and photographs. When the official pronounced them married according to the local law, there was no swell of music, only the faint tapping of rain on the small window and the soft exhale they both released at the same time. "Wait," Nye whispered fiercely, stepping forward before anyone could move. "My part." She unfolded her drawing with ceremony and held it up between them and the official. I saw them wash dishes and sign papers and chase onions, she said, mixing up memories in her hurry. They already act like this. Today is just the writing. It was as honest a witness statement as any, and the official, perhaps remembering his own children or grandchildren, smiled. Then let the record show, he replied gravely, that the smallest witness has seen the truest evidence. Papers were signed, the one-page terms initialed by both of them and tucked back into the folder. And just as they were about to leave, the door eased open and the neighbor slipped in, a little damp from the rain, breathless and apologizing. I am late, she said, patting her hair, but I brought these. In her hand were 3 small cookies wrapped in paper, the kind she used to make when her own children were small. For sweetness, she added. She was in time to sign as a witness on one copy. But even if she had missed that, her presence now felt like the closing of a small circle. Tea and ornaments, and now her name on the page with theirs. The walk back to the apartment was quieter than the walk there, but the silence was no longer heavy. It had the softness of cloth settling in a drawer, of a house exhaling after guests leave. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle that made the world smell clean. At home, the key turned in the lock once more. But this time, as Diep stepped inside, she felt the difference. A legal line had been crossed, yes, but more than that, a private line. The threshold they had been living at as almost had become now. Inside, there were no surprise parties, only the familiar table waiting, the Noel string of lights ready to be switched on even though the holiday season was past, the onion jars on the windowsill leaning a little toward the dim light. They changed out of their damp things, hung the neighbor's cookies on a small plate in the center, and brewed tea. Their first dinner as a married pair was not much different from many evenings before. Simple rice, a bit of vegetables, the cookies broken to share. But each small act felt like a quiet echo of the vows spoken earlier. When James automatically took the dishes to the sink, when Diep refilled his cup without thinking, when Nai nestled between them and leaned her head first on one shoulder, then the other. Later, after the neighbor had been invited in for a cup of tea and had blessed them in her own way with stories of her late husband and his terrible jokes. After Nai had been tucked into bed with a new drawing taped above her. 3 figures now with rings on their hands, labeled team. The apartment fell into that special kind of nighttime stillness where everything important has been said for the day. James sat at the table with the room rent folder open, sliding the new pages into place behind the old ones, while Diep stood at the window, touching the paper star that still hung there. It feels almost the same, she observed quietly. Same walls, same table, same kettle. James closed the folder and joined her, resting his hand lightly over hers on the cool glass. And also not the same, he said. Today we wrote down what we had already begun to live. She nodded, the ring on her finger catching the faint neighborhood light. Tomorrow, she said, we'll wake up and it will be groceries and gas notices and school forms again. Maybe we can start sketching that little niche you and she keep talking about. Papers and tea for neighbors who need both. It was a soft foreshadowing, not of a fairy tale future, but of a small, purposeful next chapter. 2 people and a child sitting at a well-used table, turning their shared story into something that might ease the weight of other people's papers and nights. They turned off the Noel string, left the star in the window, and went to bed under the same thin roof they had known for months now. The difference resting not in the cracks of the building, but in the quiet certainty that when the next envelope slid under the door or the next neighbor knocked with a form, they would answer not as a single girl and a temporary lodger, but as a family that had walked a short, plain aisle together and chosen, with clear eyes and steady hands, to stay. In this tender chapter, Lie to Diep's handwritten one-page yes becomes the quiet center of everything. Clear conditions to protect Nai, honor her life as a single mom, and keep money from becoming control. James agrees point by point, then calmly handles small crises. A smudged document, a possibly late witness, light rain, showing steadiness instead of pressure. At the small office with only Nai and eventually their kind neighbor beside them, they walk a plain aisle, speak short, honest vows about sharing bills, decisions, and truth, and slip on simple rings meant for everyday life, not show. Nai declares she's already seen them act like a family. Today is just the writing. Back home, their first dinner as a married pair looks like any other. Rice, tea, cookies. But the room rent folder, the key, and the ring on Diep's hand quietly mark a new beginning.